Hey there, and welcome. As you settle in tonight, let's take a journey back to a time when survival wasn't just a matter of getting through the day, but about enduring harsh conditions that tested every ounce of human strength. Picture this: the vast, cold expanse of the Wild West, where winter arrived, not with a gentle chill, but with biting winds that could freeze the soul. The snow wasn't soft. It was relentless, blanketing the land in a heavy, suffocating layer. The winds howled across the open plains, and the rugged mountains loomed like silent giants, watching over the people who lived in this unforgiving world. It was a world where the cold didn't just make life uncomfortable, it made it dangerous. Every year, when the first frost arrived, families knew that the real test of survival was beginning. The days of warm, bustling summer were long gone, replaced by a quiet, unyielding cold that demanded not only physical endurance, but mental strength as well. The snow seemed endless, and for many, so did the struggle. But in this cold, something remarkable happened. Despite the isolation and the harshness of the elements, people came together. Neighbors helped neighbors, and families huddled together for warmth, sharing not just food and fire, but the strength they needed to face another day. And that's the thing: survival in the Wild West was never a solitary endeavor. Yes, it took hard work and resilience, but it also took community. It was in those long winter nights around crackling fires and in humble homes that true bonds were formed. You'd think that the fierce cold would have driven people further apart, but instead, it brought them closer. People leaned on each other for survival, not just against the winter's chill, but against the isolation, loneliness, and struggles that came with living on the edge of the frontier. So tonight, as you listen to this story, let it be a reminder of what people can endure when they're faced with adversity. As the settlers in the Wild West proved, survival isn't just about braving the elements. It's about thriving together, finding warmth in each other's company, and drawing strength from the community when the world outside seems cold and indifferent. Before we dive deeper into the experience of living through a brutal winter in the Wild West, if you're enjoying these stories, I'd love for you to like, share, and comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Now let's settle in and reflect on how these pioneers endured one of the most challenging seasons of all, the winter that seemed to last forever. As the last rays of the setting sun slipped beneath the horizon, and the chill of night began to settle over the land, you felt it. Again, the quiet, unspoken truth that winter had come, its icy fingers creeping into every corner of your home. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the ground outside, hardened by the relentless cold, seemed to hum with a kind of quiet menace. It was a season that demanded more than just survival. It required a different kind of strength, a strength born not just of physical endurance, but of shared experience and unity. In the heart of winter, when the world seemed to shrink down into the small, warm spaces where people huddled together, something miraculous happened. You realized that survival was not just about protecting yourself from the cold, but about coming together, about sharing warmth, about leaning on each other in ways that went beyond the practical. It was in these moments, these long nights, where the fire crackled softly in the hearth and the wind outside raged against the walls, that you understood the power of communal living. You had always known that winters could be long and grueling, but nothing quite prepared you for the true nature of their hardship. You had heard the stories from the elders, the tales of how communities once survived the worst the season had to offer. But now you were living it, feeling the weight of the cold creeping into your bones, the hunger gnawing at your stomach, the silence of the world outside pressing in on you like a blanket of snow. And yet, in the midst of it all, there was a strange, comforting warmth that only came when you were surrounded by others. It wasn't just the fire that kept you warm. It was the presence of your community, the shared sense of purpose, the quiet companionship that spoke volumes even in silence. On those bitterly cold nights, you and your neighbors gathered together in the communal barn, where the warmth of bodies, the shared heat of collective effort, formed a barrier against the worst the winter could throw at you. It wasn't just the fire that made the space warm. It was the shared breath, the quiet hum of voices, the steady rhythm of life lived together. The barn, once used for livestock, had been transformed into a sanctuary. It became a place not just of work, but of rest, of shared moments, of stories told in hushed tones as the wind howled outside. There, in the center of the barn, the fire burned brightly, crackling as it sent its warmth out in all directions. The light flickered and danced across the faces of the men and women who sat around it, their tired eyes reflecting the same sense of weariness, but also something more hope. As the flames flickered, you noticed how close everyone sat. The space, though large, was filled to the brim with bodies, each person seeking warmth, each one drawing closer to the others, not just for the heat, but for the comfort of knowing they weren't alone. The children played in the corner, bundled up in layers of wool and fur, their laughter rising above the crackle of the fire, their joy filling the otherwise quiet space. They didn't understand the full weight of the cold, but they understood the warmth that came from being with those they loved. The parents wrapped in their own blankets, shared stories, their voices, a soothing backdrop to the wind outside. It was a routine, a rhythm that brought comfort amidst the harshness of the world beyond the barn's walls. There was something almost sacred about these moments, something that couldn't be put into words. The warmth wasn't just physical, it was the connection you shared with the others in that space, the way your breath came together in a shared rhythm, the way your worries were momentarily forgotten in the presence of others. This warmth, born from the shared experience of facing the same cold together, became the most vital thing in the world. It was more important than food. It was more important than shelter. Because when the world was at its coldest, when the ground beneath your feet was frozen and the trees were bare, the one thing that could keep you alive, that could keep your spirit strong, was the company of others. The communal barn wasn't the only shared space that kept people together. There was also the communal home where families gathered in the tightest quarters, each one contributing to the survival of the whole. The warmth of the home wasn't just in the fire, it was in the shared meals, the quiet moments spent together, the feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself. You had seen it in the faces of those who lived in the house next door. Parents, children, grandparents, who had learned to make do with less, but never lost sight of the importance of staying together. The evenings in those homes were marked by the same sense of connection. The children would huddle around the hearth, drawing close to their parents, listening to stories about winters gone by, about the days when the snow seemed to fall endlessly from the sky. The older folks would sit back in their chairs nodding as the younger ones talked, adding their own memories to the stories being told. The house, though cramped, felt expansive with the love that filled it, the shared laughter, the gentle teasing, the quiet comfort of knowing that despite the cold, despite the hunger, despite everything the winter could bring you, were not alone. It was here, in these shared moments, that you began to understand what it truly meant to be part of a community. It wasn't just about living in the same space or sharing the same struggles. It was about something deeper. It was about the strength that comes from knowing that when you face the cold together, when you are willing to share warmth and food and laughter, you become more than just individuals. You become a part of something much bigger, something that cannot be broken by the cold, something that survives the harshest winters and emerges stronger for it. You had learned quickly that in the depths of winter, warmth and company were as vital as food. In a world where the land could turn barren and the sky could be choked with snow, the most precious resource you had was not something you could grow, not something you could harvest. It was the people around you. Their presence, their support, their willingness to share not just the space, but their hearts became the lifeline you clung to. In the quiet of the evening, as the wind howled outside, you often found yourself thinking back to the early days of winter, to the way people seemed to come together almost instinctively. It wasn't just about survival, it was about preserving something that winter could never take from you: connection. The cold could freeze the earth, but it could never freeze the bond between you and those who shared your life. That bond, that warmth, became a shield against the cold, a source of strength when you had none left to give. It was a reminder that no matter how harsh the winter, you would always have each other. As the days passed and the cold began to recede, you realized that the true gift of the winter months wasn't in surviving the frost, the hunger, or the endless nights. It was in the way those challenges had brought you closer, not just to the earth, but to one another. You had learned that the greatest warmth in life doesn't come from the fire, but from the people who gather around it, sharing their lives, their stories, and their strength. And so, as the seasons began to change and the first signs of spring crept into the land, you felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the warmth of the sun, but for the warmth of the people you had weathered the storm with. In the depths of winter, you had discovered something far more enduring than warmth. It was the shared experience of surviving together, of facing the world's harshest trials, not alone but as a community bound together by the simple, unspoken truth that together you could withstand anything. As the final whispers of the long, cold winter fade away and the first signs of spring beckon through the frost-bitten trees, you awaken not just from a long, chilly slumber, but from a season of struggle. The harshness of the winter has left its mark not only on the land that now begins to thaw, but also on your body, your health, and your spirit. It is as though the season of biting cold has taken its toll in ways that are not always visible, but are felt deeply within. You might step out into the emerging warmth of the sun, the earth still hard beneath your feet, and feel an overwhelming weight in your chest, an exhaustion that doesn't easily shake off. The recovery from winter's embrace is not immediate. No, it is a gradual process, slow and full of reminders of just how hard it has been. You see, the toll that winter takes is not merely physical. It begins with your body weakened by the relentless cold. Throughout the winter, your muscles have tightened, stiffened, with each bitter gust of wind that howled through the cracks in your shelter. You feel it in your bones, that deep ache that settles in your joints. The body starved of warmth slows down digestion, circulation, and movement becomes sluggish. There is a constant pull, a heavy exhaustion that seems to settle deep inside you. And no matter how much sleep you get, you always wake up feeling as though the cold has followed you into your dreams. It's the same for everyone. You are not alone in this. The once strong, energetic people of your small community now move slowly, their bodies like machines that have been overworked and underfed. Your neighbors, who once carried their burdens with a sense of purpose, now shuffle around their steps slower, their spirits quieter. They too bear the marks of a long winter. Every cough and weary sigh is a reminder of the toll the cold has taken. You've witnessed it in their faces, pale hollowed from too many days without sunlight, without warmth. They speak of the sickness that lingers in the air like a shadow. Coughs echo in the evenings, and feverish sweats plague those whose bodies have not yet recovered from the harshness of the cold. Children, once full of energy, are quieter, now their bodies weaker, their appetites dimmed by the lack of fresh food during the months of frozen scarcity. Your own body is a reminder of the battle. The winter's toll has left you more than just physically exhausted. It has left you bruised in ways that are harder to mend. Every step you take feels like a small victory against your own limitations. You find yourself needing more rest than usual, but even as you sleep, you are haunted by that chill, that never-ending feeling of coldness that has seeped into your very core. The body aches to recover, but it is a slow, painful process. The muscles, stiff from months of tension, cry out as you stretch them for the first time in a long while. They protest against the simple movements as though they too have forgotten what it feels like to move freely. But the physical toll is only part of the story. For as your body strains to find its rhythm again, so too does your mind. Winter, in all its silence and isolation, leaves deep marks on your spirit. The isolation you endured in the harsh months, long hours, in the dim light of early sunsets, the endless days of snow and wind, has worn down not just your body, but your sense of hope. The world outside your shelter was a frozen wasteland, a place where survival was all that mattered, and joy was a rare, fleeting thing. Now, as the world begins to thaw, you feel the weight of it all, the longing for warmth, for connection, for a return to the life you once knew. But that life is not so easily returned to. The hunger of winter lingers, and not just in the stomach. there is a gnawing emptiness in your heart, a quiet sadness that the cold has planted deep within you. Your spirit feels weak, weathered, as if the very essence of you has been battered by the storm. You look around and see that you are not the only one struggling. Your neighbors are tired, too weary, not just from the cold, but from the silence, the lack of human contact. The long nights have left you all starved for more than just food. You are starved for warmth, for light, for laughter. And that hunger can be just as difficult to satisfy as any physical need. As you emerge from the depths of winter, you realize that the recovery period isn't just about getting your strength back. It's about reclaiming the life that the cold season took from you. You yearn for the days when you could work the fields without feeling the weight of the cold in every movement. You long for the laughter of your children running through the meadows, for the joy of sitting around a fire with your friends telling stories. But the cold has taken those moments from you, and now, as the thaw comes, it is clear that they won't come back easily. The lack of resources is another heavy weight that you must bear. The winter months have drained what little you had. The stores of food, once abundant, are now running low. You have had to rely on whatever scraps you could find, whatever dried meats and preserved vegetables that could withstand the cold. The hunger pangs you feel now are not just physical. They are reminders of the scarcity that winter brings. Even as the days warm, the land remains stubborn, still frozen in some places, unwilling to offer up its harvest just yet. There is a quiet desperation in the air as people begin to realize the extent of what they've lost. The crops won't come in for a while, and the food reserves are dangerously low. The firewood, too, is running out, and you know that you must find more. But the ground is still too hard to dig, too frozen to gather from the trees. The animals that were once your source of food are thin, exhausted from the long winter, their hides barely covering their bones. It's a time of scrounging, of scraping together what little remains. You find yourself relying on the goodwill of your neighbors, bartering, sharing, doing what you can to ensure that no one goes without. But even the bartering is difficult now, for many are in the same position, and there is little to give. But perhaps the hardest part is the mental strain. As the days lengthen, the physical recovery begins, but the mental recovery is a much slower journey. The cold has a way of stealing not just warmth, but a sense of joy. The darkness, the endless nights have left their imprint on your mind. The bright days are harder to embrace now, and the thoughts that creep into your mind are not easily shaken off. Will there be enough food? Will the spring come in time? Will you have the strength to carry on? These are the questions that plague your thoughts. Your once sunny disposition is harder to summon, replaced by a quiet underlying fear. You watch as others too fight the shadows that winter has cast upon their hearts. The hope that the thaw will bring easy relief is slowly fading, replaced by the harsh reality that recovery is not immediate. It is a journey, one that requires more than just physical effort. It requires patience, trust in the changing seasons, and faith that the warmth will return not just to the earth, but to your heart. And so you wait. You wait for the days to stretch longer, for the food to come, for the strength to return. The first days of spring are not an instant cure. They are only the beginning of a long, slow process of healing. You are not alone in this. Your neighbors, your family, your community are all waiting too. Together, you will recover piece by piece, inch by inch, as the harsh reality of post-winter sleep fades and the warmth of the world once again settles into your bones. As you sit by the fire, feeling the warmth slowly creep back into your chilled bones, the world outside is beginning to change. The snow no longer blankets the earth as it once did. The frozen landscape is now giving way to the first hints of spring. Yet even as the thaw begins, a deep, unspoken truth lingers in the air. Surviving the brutal cold of winter is a feat not easily forgotten nor lightly achieved. The resilience of those who have lived through it, who have weathered nature's harshest trials, is something far beyond physical endurance. It is a strength carved by years of pushing against the unyielding grip of nature. And you know more than anyone that true survival requires more than just the will to endure. It takes grit, the kind that is etched into your soul after seasons of struggle, and you've seen it in others too. Take, for example, the story of old Tom, a man who had spent more winters than you could count, a man who had faced each season with the same unwavering determination. You've heard his name spoken around the hearth always with respect, but there's something in the way the elders speak of him that makes you realize he is more legend than man now. Tom's story is one of survival in its purest form, forged in the relentless cold of this unforgiving world. Tom, when you first met him, was already an older man. His hair silver, his skin weathered and deeply tanned from a lifetime spent outdoors. He never spoke much about his youth, but the lines etched into his face told the story of countless winters of struggles, fought in silence of hunger, endured, and of frostbite that nearly took his fingers. He had lived on his own for many years, even in the harshest of conditions in a small cabin tucked far away from the rest of the world, hidden from the noise and distraction of society. His cabin was humble, barely more than a few walls and a hearth, but to him it was a fortress of solitude. You'd hear stories from those who had crossed paths with him. They spoke of how Tom would venture out into the wilderness long after the first snows had fallen seeking firewood, when the trees were bare, cutting through the ice on the river, when others dared not venture near it. They said he never feared the cold, but you knew it wasn't fearlessness. Tom simply knew what had to be done. It was that quiet determination, that mental and physical grit, that kept him alive when so many others would have faltered. One winter, the cold came early, and with it a fierce storm that battered the land relentlessly. For days, the wind howled through the trees, sending snow spiraling through the air in thick, blinding sheets. The storm was fierce enough to make even the most seasoned survivors second-guess their plans. But Tom, despite the worst conditions, never hesitated. When the storm passed, leaving a blanket of snow thick and deep, the temperature dropped even further, reaching levels few could withstand for long. It was during this storm that Tom's grit truly became evident. He had been out checking his traps, hoping to gather some game, but when the storm hit, he knew immediately that it would be days before he could make his way back. His cabin was still several miles away, and in that moment, Tom faced the same decision anyone would stay put and hope the storm would pass or push through, knowing it would take every ounce of his strength. And that was where Tom's true grit showed. He knew that survival wasn't about waiting for things to get better. It was about pushing forward even when the odds seemed insurmountable. With the wind howling in his ears and the bitter cold seeping into his very bones, Tom forged ahead. His steps were slow and methodical, each one a calculated effort to keep moving forward. He didn't rush. He couldn't afford to. Every step was a battle against the cold, a battle against his own exhaustion. And even as his breath fogged up in the freezing air and his hands became numb from the cold, Tom knew that there was no turning back. You can only imagine the strain it must have taken for him to continue with each movement, feeling like a monumental effort. But Tom was no stranger to hardship. It was the resilience built over the years, over countless winters like this one, that allowed him to push through the physical and mental barriers. Every winter had been a lesson in endurance, in knowing how to stretch a limited supply of resources, how to find warmth when the fire seemed like a distant dream, how to make do with what little you had. When Tom finally made it back to his cabin, his body was weary beyond belief. His boots were caked in ice, his face wind-burned and raw, but he had done it. He had survived. And that story, the story of his survival, wasn't just about the physical endurance it took to keep moving. It was about the mental strength, the refusal to give in to the overwhelming temptation to stop, to rest, to let the cold win. But Tom wasn't the only one. In your community, there are many like him individuals who have survived the cold by sheer willpower. People like Sarah, who lived with her 3 young children in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. When the winter came early and food became scarce, Sarah faced the most trying challenge of all, keeping her children safe and warm. The lack of resources made every day a battle. There were moments when the fire would burn out during the night, and Sarah would wake to find the cabin colder than she could bear. But she would rise anyway, no matter how bitter the cold. You've heard Sarah's story countless times, and each retelling is a reminder of just how much grit can be contained within a person. There were days when she could barely hold her children because her hands were too cold, too stiff, but she never stopped moving, never stopped fighting for their survival. She found ways to stretch what little food they had, preserving it for the days ahead. She hunted when it was possible, and when it wasn't, she relied on what she could gather, even if it meant trudging miles through deep snow for a handful of berries. Through all of it, Sarah remained unshaken. She did what she had to do for her children. And when the winter thawed and spring arrived, she stood stronger than before. You hear these stories, and you know that they are not the exception. In this world, grit is something that is forged by every trial faced. Each winter, you endure, each storm you weather leaves you stronger, more capable, more resilient. These tales are not about extraordinary feats of heroism, but rather about the quiet strength of ordinary people who are tested by the harshness of nature and who push through day after day. The kind of grit that Tom and Sarah possess is not born overnight. It is not something you can develop in a single season or from one struggle. It is built over time, with each challenge, each difficulty, each obstacle that stands between you and survival. It is the mental strength to keep going when every part of you screams to stop. It is the physical endurance to withstand the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, and to emerge from it stronger than before. In these winters, survival is not a matter of luck. It's a matter of willpower, of knowing that no matter how tough it gets, you can endure. It's about having the strength to wake up every morning and face another day in the cold knowing that with each new day, you are one step closer to the warmth of spring. And so, as you listen to these stories, as you reflect on the resilience of Tom Sarah and all those who have survived the harshest winters, you realize that their strength is not something extraordinary. It is simply the strength of those who have learned to endure, who have learned that survival is not about avoiding hardship, but about embracing it, pushing through it, and coming out stronger on the other side. Their grit is a testament to the power of human resilience, a power that is not built in moments of comfort, but in moments of struggle, when the cold seems endless, but the will to survive is unbreakable. As you step out into the still chilly morning, the lingering cold of winter still holds its grasp over the land. The world around you is slowly awakening from its long slumber, but there's no denying the harshness of the season that still hangs in the air. You can feel the bite of the frost beneath your boots, the weight of the long months pressing on your shoulders. Yet despite the lingering chill, there's a sense of peace that comes with the understanding of what you've endured. This time, like so many before it, you've survived. But it wasn't just your strength that carried you through it, was the knowledge passed down through generations of how to live with the land, how to adapt to its demands, and how to survive the brutal winters that define this life. You think back to the stories your elders shared with you, the stories about your great-grandfather, about the ancestors who had faced winters even harsher than these. They didn't just survive, they thrived in the most unforgiving conditions. Their survival wasn't a matter of chance or strength alone. No, their survival was rooted in ancient practices, wisdom learned over thousands of years, honed by experience and passed down through the generations. These practices, simple, effective, and deeply tied to the land, became the foundation of everything you knew about surviving the bitter cold. And as the frost slowly begins to melt away, you realize just how much of that wisdom still influences the way you live today. One of the first things that comes to mind when you think of those old ways is the clothing crafted with an intimate understanding of the land and its resources. Your great-grandfather had spoken often of the warmth that came from the animals that lived alongside them, and how they used every part of the animal not just for food, but for survival. The clothes they wore were made from the fur and hides of animals they had hunted, beavers, foxes, deer. Each offered something essential, whether it was the warmth of fur to protect against the chill, or the durability of leather to withstand the elements. These garments weren't just for warmth. They were designed to breathe, to adapt to the wearer's body, keeping them warm without suffocating them under layers that would trap moisture. Your great-grandfather would tell you about the layered clothing they wore, during the deepest of winters. Each layer had a purpose, some to trap warmth, some to wick moisture away, and some to protect against the wind and snow. They wore fur-lined coats, boots made from tanned leather, and gloves crafted from the pelts of animals. Every stitch in those garments was made with care and attention, each one a piece of knowledge passed down from someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to use the land's gifts to survive. Their clothing wasn't just functional, it was a lifeline, a physical manifestation of everything the ancestors had learned over generations about how to endure the harshest conditions. It wasn't just the clothing, though. The homes they built were just as much a testament to their ingenuity and understanding of the land. You remember your great-grandfather speaking about the cabins they built, how they were designed to withstand the brutal winds that could tear through the mountains in the dead of winter. The walls of their homes were thick, made from logs that had been carefully chosen for their ability to insulate. Some homes even had double or triple layers of wood, a design meant to keep the cold out and the warmth in. The floor of the cabin was raised off the ground with a cellar below to store food and supplies where the cold couldn't reach them. The roofs were sloped rounded to prevent the weight of snow from accumulating and collapsing the structure. Inside, the warmth of the fire was central to everything. The hearth was not just a place to cook. It was the heart of the home, providing warmth, light, and a place for people to gather and share stories. But perhaps the most vital of all the lessons was the knowledge of how to feed themselves through the winter. In the old days, there was no such thing as a grocery store stocked with fresh produce. If they were to survive, it was up to the community to prepare, to preserve, and to make the most of what the land offered. The elders taught you the ways of smoking, salting, and drying meat, of canning vegetables, and of storing food in ways that would keep it from spoiling during the months when the ground was frozen solid. Fish dried and salted could be kept for months. Vegetables were preserved in jars stored in cool, dark places. It was not just about surviving the cold months. It was about preparing for them, understanding the rhythms of nature, and using the resources of the land in a sustainable way. Even now, you find yourself relying on these ancient methods. When you hunt, you think about what your ancestors would have done with each part of the animal. When you prepare meals, you recall the lessons of your great-grandfather about how to preserve and stretch what little you had. In the depths of winter, when the land is covered in snow and the sky is a sheet of gray, you understand that survival isn't about having the latest gear or the most advanced technology. It's about knowing how to live in harmony with the land, how to use its resources wisely, and how to prepare for what it can throw at you. These old ways passed down through generations, continue to guide you to shape the way you approach the world around you. The practices of the indigenous people weren't just about surviving, they were about thriving in the face of adversity. They understood that the land would always be there, but it was up to them to respect it, to work with it, and to adapt to its demands. The lessons of the past are not merely quaint stories to be told around the fire. They are practical, functional ways of living that continue to influence how you survive today. The ancient wisdom passed down through generations has taught you how to live in a way that is sustainable, respectful, and deeply connected to the earth. As the last vestiges of winter slowly melt away and the world begins to warm, you find yourself grateful for the lessons of the past, the ways of your ancestors, how they clothed themselves, how they built their homes, how they preserved their food are not just relics of a bygone era. They are alive in you, in the choices you make, in the way you approach the world. You see the world differently now, not just as a place to survive, but as a place to thrive, to live in balance with the land, and to pass on the knowledge that has kept generations of people alive for centuries. The old ways continue to hold value today more so than ever. In a world full of conveniences and modern technology, it's easy to forget the deep connection we have with the earth, with the seasons, and with the wisdom of those who lived before us. But when the cold comes, when the nights grow long, and when the land seems to sleep beneath a blanket of snow, you know that survival is not just about what you have. It's about what you know. And the wisdom of the past will always guide you through the cold. As the last embers of the fire crackled, casting a warm glow against the walls of your small cabin, you couldn't help but reflect on the world beyond. The cold was a constant companion, now gripping the land with icy fingers and slowing everything down. The winds howled through the trees, and the sky above seemed to stretch endlessly, a pale canvas of gray and white. The world, it seemed, had gone to sleep. But in this silence, in the stillness of winter, there was a deeper understanding that you had come to appreciate. In the harshest months, nature was not a foe to be battled, it was a teacher, a guide showing you how to endure, how to find rhythm in the cold, and how to learn from the world around you. Winter, you had come to understand, was not just a season of survival. It was a time when the rhythms of nature slowed, when the earth itself seemed to rest, and the animals around you, those who had once been so lively in the warmer months, withdrew into their dens and burrows, hibernating until the spring thaw would awaken them once again. You had learned that this was not a time of stagnation, but of balance and opportunity for reflection and learning. And you, like the animals who retreated to their shelters, had to adapt to listen and to learn from nature's subtle signs. The first thing you noticed as winter took hold was the absence of the usual bustle. The birds, so full of life and song during the summer, were quiet now. Even the creatures of the forest, the squirrels and foxes, were less active, retreating into their dens where they would sleep away the cold months. The world seemed smaller in winter, the landscapes tighter and more defined by the quiet of nature's slumber. It was almost as though the land itself was taking a long breath, preparing for the eventual burst of life that would come with the warming of the sun. And yet, despite the stillness, there was something profoundly alive in the air. Nature was not dead. It was simply resting. The earth, though frozen, was rich with potential, waiting for the first signs of spring to bring it back to life. But in the meantime, you had to listen to pay attention to the small, subtle cues nature offered you. Every shift in the wind, every slight change in the weather was a lesson. It was as if nature had its own language, and it was up to you to decipher it. You remember the first real snowfall of the season. It came quietly, almost unexpectedly, covering the world in a soft blanket of white. As you stepped outside, the air was crisp, biting, and clean. The wind had a sharp edge, cutting through the silence of the woods. Yet as you looked around, you saw the tracks of animals, deer, rabbits, even the occasional fox that had wandered out in search of food, their steps light, careful, as though they too were paying attention to the rhythm of the season. You could feel it then, the pulse of winter, slow and steady, like the beating of a heart. The animals you had come to realize were the masters of this world. They understood the rhythm of winter in a way that humans often did not. Their survival depended on it. The bears hibernated their bodies, slowing down, conserving energy for the months ahead. The foxes and rabbits built their nests deep in the snow, burrowing beneath the surface where the earth remained warmer. Even the smallest creatures, like the field mice, knew where to find shelter and food, hiding in the underbrush, waiting out the cold. You often found yourself marveling at how nature had created these patterns, these instincts that allowed the creatures of the wild to thrive even in the harshest of winters. Their survival was a testament to nature's wisdom, a wisdom that you as a human had to learn if you were to make it through. You could not fight nature, could not force it to bend to your will, but you could observe it, understand it, and learn from it. In the winter months, the land revealed its secrets in subtle ways. The way the wind shifted direction meant a change in the weather, a storm on the horizon. The way the snow settled on the trees indicated how heavy the fall would be, how much to expect from the season's fury. These were the signs you had learned to watch for, signs that would determine whether your supplies would last, whether you needed to gather more firewood, or whether the time had come to venture out and hunt. You had learned over time that nature's rhythms weren't just about weather patterns or animal behavior. They were about understanding the ebb and flow of life itself. Winter was a time of rest, a time for regeneration, but it was also a time for preparation. As the animals hibernated, they did so not out of laziness, but out of necessity. They understood that survival required patience, that the cold would eventually give way to warmth, and that the land would once again burst forth with life. It was during these long months of quiet that you truly began to see the wisdom in nature's ways. You learned to slow down, to move with the rhythm of the land. The cold was no longer something to fight against, but something to embrace, something that offered its own kind of peace. In the quiet of winter, you found a certain stillness in your soul, a calmness that allowed you to hear the world in a different way. It was a time to reflect, to appreciate the small things, the way the snowflakes drifted from the sky, the way the trees creaked in the wind, the way the earth seemed to breathe beneath your feet. You often thought about how the ancient people, those who had lived long before you, understood these rhythms so much more deeply. They knew the land, its cycles, its secrets. They understood that winter was not a time to conquer, but a time to listen, to learn, and to adapt. They too had observed the animals, and the land had learned when to hunt, when to gather, and when to rest. Their survival depended on their ability to read the signs nature gave them, to understand the subtle clues that indicated when the time had come to prepare for the worst or to celebrate the coming of something better. Even in the dead of winter, there was life in nature. The animals, though, hidden away in their dens, were still very much a part of the landscape, their movements dictated by ancient instincts that had been honed over centuries. You realized that in many ways they were your teachers. The way the birds flew south, the way the bears slowed their movements to conserve energy, the way the trees bent in the wind. These were all lessons, small clues that nature was offering you about how to survive, how to thrive in the cold. And so, as the days passed and the snow continued to fall, You found yourself growing more attuned to the land around you. You began to understand that survival wasn't just about finding warmth or food. It was about living in harmony with nature, about respecting its rhythms, and about recognizing the signs that would guide you through the toughest seasons. The animals, the trees, the earth, they all spoke to you in their own way. And as you listened, you found that you were no longer simply surviving the winter. You were learning from it, growing with it, and becoming a part of the land itself. When the first hints of spring finally arrived, you felt a deep sense of gratitude. You had made it through the winter, yes, but more than that, you had learned something invaluable. You had learned the art of listening, of observing, of living in sync with the land. And as the earth began to warm, you understood that the lessons of winter would stay with you, shaping the way you would live with the land for years to come. In the heart of winter's sleep, nature had not only taught you how to survive, it had shown you how to live in balance with the world around you, how to read its rhythms, and how to embrace its quiet wisdom. As the first light of spring touches the horizon, casting a soft golden hue over the land, you find yourself standing in the quiet aftermath of winter's hold. The snow has started to melt, revealing patches of earth that have lain dormant under a thick, icy blanket for months. The once barriered landscape now seems vast and open, stretching toward the sky as the heavy silence of winter slowly gives way to the sounds of returning life. Birds begin to sing, the wind shifts with a warmer breath, and in the distance you hear the soft crunch of new growth poking through the thawed ground. Yet as the world outside begins to stir, you remain rooted to the place where winter's lessons still echo in your thoughts. It's a quiet kind of reflection, one that carries the weight of the cold season, of the trials endured, and of the resilience that you and those around you have drawn from the darkness and the chill. Winter, in all its severity, has not only shaped the landscape, it has shaped you, deepened you, hardened you in ways you didn't fully understand until now. When the cold first arrived, it seemed like a wall that divided the world into two, the warmth of the fire within and the brutal cold of the world beyond. It was a time when survival felt like a fragile, tenuous thing. You remember the early days of winter when the days grew shorter and the cold seemed to gnaw at your very bones. The world outside felt far more menacing. The frost on the trees, the biting winds that cut through even the thickest layers of clothing, and the silence of the land as it slept, all of it seemed so indifferent to your struggle. Yet you persisted. In the deepest parts of winter, when the cold seemed endless and hope seemed distant, you learned something. You learned the true meaning of endurance, not just surviving the cold, but finding a way to endure it with grace, patience, and grit. Every cold morning when you rose, every step you took into the frozen world, you learned something new about yourself. You realized that in the face of the unrelenting winter, it wasn't your strength alone that would carry you through. It was your ability to adapt, to listen to the land, to lean on others, and to embrace the quiet resilience that lay deep within you. You had seen it in the faces of your neighbors too, their quiet determination, their ability to keep going despite the hardships. Every winter was a shared experience, a collective test of endurance, and you learned that it was the bonds between people that made it possible to endure. There was something sacred about those long, silent nights spent gathered around the fire, sharing warmth, stories, and the simple comfort of knowing that you weren't alone. As the cold settled in, so did the strength of the community. You leaned on each other for support, for company, for the emotional and physical warmth that helped you through the darkest nights. But as the days began to lengthen and the cold slowly receded, you felt it more profoundly, the strength that had been built within you. You had not just survived the winter, you had been shaped by it. The cold, the isolation, the hardship, each of these had tested you, had pushed you to the edge of your limits, and in doing so, they had revealed your true resilience. The winter had been a teacher, one that had shown you your own capacity for endurance. And it wasn't just about the physical toll of the cold, though, that had been significant. It was about the mental and emotional strength that had kept you going when it felt like the cold would never end. You recall the days when the fire seemed too weak to ward off the chill, when the food stores began to run low and the nights stretched on endlessly. During those times, the struggle wasn't just against the cold, it was a battle against fear. Fear of running out of food, of not being able to keep your loved ones warm, of losing hope in the face of something so powerful and uncontrollable. And yet, despite that fear, you pressed on. It was a quiet kind of strength. Small decisions made each day, each moment of discomfort, each decision to keep going despite the odds. That was what winter taught you, the ability to endure, not just the harsh conditions of the cold, but the uncertainty, the fear, the doubt that often accompanied it. As you look back now, the significance of surviving winter becomes clear. It wasn't just about making it to the other side. It was about what you became in the process. The cold had stripped away the superficial, the unnecessary. It had left you with only what was truly essential: your connection to the land, to the people around you, and to yourself. You understood now that the cold season wasn't just a challenge. It was a crucible one that forged character, deepened resilience, and bound people together in ways that nothing else could. In the quiet after the storm, as the first signs of spring began to emerge, you felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the warmth returning to the earth, but for the strength that the winter had revealed. The cold had tested you, yes, but it had also strengthened you in ways you could not have anticipated. It was a reminder that endurance is not something that is given, it is something that is earned, forged in the fires of hardship, and tempered by the trials of life. You have seen this strength in others as well. The way the elders speak of their winters past, the quiet pride in their voices as they recall the struggles they overcame. For them, winter was a rite of passage, a time to reflect on how far they had come, how much they had endured. And as you listen to their stories, you realize that winter is not just a season, it is a symbol of human resilience, a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest times, there is a strength within us that cannot be extinguished. Each winter survived becomes a measure of all that you have overcome, all that you have learned about your own capacity to endure, to adapt, and to rise. In the community, too, there is a sense of collective reflection. As the seasons shift and the snow melts, you find yourself gathering with your neighbors, sharing stories of the winter past. They speak of the challenges they faced, the fears they conquered, and the quiet victories they achieved. These reflections are not just about survival, they are about growth. Winter, in its harshness, has a way of sharpening the soul. It has a way of revealing the true depth of human resilience, of showing you what you are capable of when pushed to your limits. And as you sit around the fire, listening to these stories, you realize that winter is more than just a test of survival. It is a measure of who you are. Surviving the cold season is a reflection of your strength, your perseverance, and your ability to adapt. It is a reminder that no matter how fierce the storm, no matter how cold the night, you have the power to endure. You have the strength to face the challenges ahead, whatever they may be, and come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more deeply connected to the land and to each other. As you look out at the thawing landscape, the promise of spring in the air, you understand now that the true meaning of survival is not just in making it through the cold. It is in how you emerge from it, how you carry the lessons learned, the strength gained, and the connections formed into the next season. Winter may have tested you, but it has also shaped you. It has reminded you that resilience is not just about surviving. It is about growing stronger through the challenges, about emerging from the darkness with a deeper understanding of your own strength. The cold may have passed, but the resilience it forged within you will remain a part of you always. The long nights of winter had a way of turning the world into a dark, silent place. The kind of dark where you could hear your own heartbeat echoing in the stillness, where the cold wrapped around you like a blanket that refused to be shaken off. As the snow fell thickly outside and the winds howled, you felt the bite of winter creeping into every corner of your home. But amid the quiet of the cold, there was always one thing that provided both warmth and comfort: the fire. You can't remember a time when the fire wasn't the centerpiece of your life during the harsh winter months. It was more than just a source of heat. It was the heart of your survival, the one constant that kept the darkness at bay. The flame that flickered and danced in the hearth was a living thing, breathing in and out, offering its warmth and light to all who gathered around it. When the days grew shorter and the world outside seemed to fade into the emptiness of winter, the fire was the one thing that kept you grounded, the one thing that turned your humble cabin into a home. You recall the way it felt when the first frost would begin to creep in, how the hearth would be stoked to life in the early mornings. The crackling of the kindling, the slow, steady rise of the flames, the smell of burning wood filling the air. It was a ritual as old as the winter itself. As soon as the fire was lit, the world inside seemed to change. The cold, the silence, the distance, they all seemed to melt away in the warmth of the flames. You would pull your chair closer to the hearth, feeling the heat seep into your bones, knowing that you were safe for one more night. It was not just the fire's warmth that made it so important, though. It was its power to bring people together. The fire was where stories were shared, where laughter filled the room, where the worries of the outside world were left at the door. It was the gathering place, the heart of the home where people came together to rest, to reconnect, and to find solace in one another's company. In a world where the winter months could stretch on endlessly, the fire became a symbol of hope of life. It was a reminder that despite the cold and the darkness, you were not alone. The warmth of the fire was as much about the human connection it fostered as it was about the physical heat it provided. You think back to the times when you were younger, when the fire seemed to hold even more magic than it does now. As a child, you would sit with your family around the hearth, your eyes wide with wonder as the flames danced in the dark. Your mother's voice, soft and soothing, would tell tales of the old days of winters long past and the struggles your ancestors had faced. Your father would sit beside you, his eyes glowing in the firelight, as he worked his hands carving the wood for new tools, mending the things that had broken in the harsh months. The warmth of the fire was always a place of comfort, of community, where you were surrounded by those you loved, and where the outside world seemed to fall away. Even now, when the fire is no longer as vital to your survival as it once was, it still carries the same significance. It is not just a source of warmth, it is a reminder of the bond that holds you to this land, to your family, and to the community that surrounds you. The fire, like the land itself, is both a tool and a symbol of resilience, of life, of the strength it takes to endure the harshest of winters and emerge from them stronger than before. And then there is the tradition of making fire, the skill that has been passed down through the generations from your ancestors to you. You remember your father teaching you how to build a fire from scratch, how to gather the right kind of wood, how to start the flame with nothing but the right technique and patience. It was a skill that required respect for the elements, a deep understanding of the way fire behaved, and how it could be coaxed into life. Your father's hands, steady and sure, would guide yours as you struck the flint, the sparks flying off in the cold, the smell of the burning tinder filling the air. Each strike of the flint was a reminder that fire was not just a convenience, it was a lifeline, a skill that could mean the difference between warmth and cold, life and death. You remember the pride in your father's eyes as you finally learned how to make a fire on your own, as you mastered the skill that had kept your people alive through countless winters. It was a rite of passage, one that connected you to those who had come before you, to the generations of people who had learned to live with the land, to survive through the cold, and to find warmth in the most unlikely places. The ability to create fire, to harness its power, was a symbol of human resilience, of the ingenuity and determination that had kept your people going in the face of adversity. The traditional methods of making fire were not just practical, they were a way of honoring the land, a way of showing respect for the elements and the resources they provided. It wasn't just about striking a spark and lighting a flame. It was about understanding the land, knowing which types of wood burned best, which twigs made the best kindling, and how to carefully stoke the fire to make it last. It was a skill that required patience, foresight, and a deep connection to the earth itself. The fire was never something that could be taken for granted. It had to be earned every time. As the seasons passed and the world began to thaw, you couldn't help but reflect on the way the fire had shaped your life. It was more than just a tool for survival. It had been the center of every communal gathering, every family dinner, every night spent huddled together against the cold. It had brought people together, warmed hearts, and sparked the sharing of stories and laughter. It had kept you safe, kept you alive, and kept you connected to those you loved. In a world where the cold could strip away so much, the fire had always been the one thing that remained a constant source of warmth, light, and life. As you sat by the hearth now, watching the flames dance and flicker, you realized just how deeply fire had become woven into the fabric of your existence. It was not just the fire that warmed you, but the rituals that surrounded it, the act of building it, of tending to it, of passing on the knowledge of how to make it burn. These were the things that had held your people together, that had helped them survive the harshest winters, and that would continue to shape the generations to come. The fire in all its simplicity was a symbol of the resilience that ran through your blood, the strength that had carried your people through countless winters. It was a reminder that no matter how cold the world may get, there is always warmth to be found, always light to be shared, as long as you know how to tend to the flame. The fire, after all, was not just a lifeline. It was the heartbeat of the world, the rhythm that had kept your ancestors alive, and that would continue to keep you going through the coldest winters and the darkest nights. In the stillness of winter, as the flames burned bright, you knew that the fire would always be there. Its warmth, its light, its power, ready to guide you through the darkest of times, to remind you of the strength that lies within, and to keep the cold at bay. It was more than just survival. It was life. As the days grew shorter and the bite of winter began to tighten its grip on the land, you started to feel the weight of the cold in a way you hadn't yet experienced. The warmth of the autumn sun seemed a distant memory, and each morning the frost grew thicker, coating everything in a silver blanket that sparkled in the early light. The land had shifted. Where there had once been the vibrant colors of fall, now only stark barren trees and endless stretches of white snow remained. It was in this new, unforgiving world that you began to truly understand the depth of adaptation that survival demanded. The cold was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a force to be reckoned with, and you had to learn quickly how to live with it. Your thoughts often returned to the stories passed down by your elders, tales of how they had endured the harshest winters, of the ways they had learned to survive when the cold threatened to swallow everything. You knew these stories by heart, but now, living through the seasons yourself, you began to see the truth behind them. Survival wasn't about having the right tools or the strongest body. It was about adaptation, both physical and mental. The land and its extreme weather didn't care about your plans. The only thing that mattered was how you learned to live within its rhythms. The first lesson came with your clothing. Before the cold truly set in, you had learned that layers were the key to survival. The concept seemed simple enough. Keep warm by adding layers upon layers of clothing. But it wasn't just about wearing more clothes. It was about understanding the purpose of each layer, how they work together to keep you insulated and protected from the wind and snow. The base layer, soft and moisture wicking, had to stay close to your skin, pulling sweat away so you didn't become chilled. Above that, you needed the insulating layers, thick wool or fur that trapped the body heat, maintaining warmth, even when the air around you was frigid. And finally, the outer layer, tough and weather-resistant, kept out the wind, the snow, and the biting cold that seemed to seep into every crack and crevice. Each layer had a specific job, and when worn together, they created a barrier between your body and the brutal winter world outside. You remembered your grandfather's advice on the importance of not just layering your clothing, but also understanding how to adjust it. He would tell you how there were days when the wind howled so fiercely that even the thickest coats couldn't keep the cold at bay, and other days when the sun would briefly peek out, offering a moment of warmth. That was when you learned to strip down a layer or two to adapt to the weather's whims. It was about constantly assessing the conditions and responding to them, much like a soldier preparing for battle. You couldn't simply stay bundled up all the time. You had to move with the weather, to listen to the land, and feel how your body reacted. The process of adaptation became second nature over time. But clothing alone was not enough. The shelter you called home had to become a fortress against the cold. You had grown up with a deep respect for the structures your ancestors had built, knowing that their survival depended as much on the way they had constructed their homes as it did on the fire that burned within. The small cabin you now called home wasn't much, but it had been built with care, using thick logs tightly packed together to create walls that could withstand the worst winter storms. The roof was steeply pitched to allow snow to slide off, and the windows, small and carefully positioned, minimized heat loss. The door, heavy and solid, had been built to keep the bitter winds from sneaking inside, and every crack, every gap had been sealed with care. Inside the hearth was the heart of the cabin, but it wasn't just the fire that kept the place warm. It was the way the space was used, the way every inch was designed to conserve and radiate heat. You learned to position yourself close to the fire when the nights grew long, wrapping yourself in thick blankets, huddling together with your family or neighbors for warmth. You'd seen it as a child, how the whole community would come together in the coldest nights, sharing the warmth of a single hearth. How the cabins would fill with the sound of laughter stories and the steady crackle of burning wood. It was in these moments, when the outside world was dark and frozen, that you understood the power of communal living. Survival wasn't just about being prepared on your own. It was about coming together, about sharing warmth and resources, about finding strength in one another. But perhaps the most challenging lesson, the one that tested your resilience the most, was the mental adaptation to the severe weather. The cold was harsh, unyielding, but the isolation, the stillness, that was what truly tested your spirit. In the early days of winter, the weight of isolation seemed heavier with each passing day. The nights stretched on endlessly, and the days felt shorter as you huddled within the walls of your cabin. There were days when the winds howled so fiercely that you couldn't even hear the animals outside, when the world beyond your door seemed to disappear, completely swallowed by the snow. The loneliness of it was suffocating, a kind of quiet despair that hung over the land like a heavy fog. But this too was a test, one that required as much mental strength as physical endurance. You learned to embrace the solitude, to find solace in the stillness. You learned to trust the rhythms of winter, to find a rhythm in yourself that matched the seasons. You found joy in the small things, the way the fire flickered, the satisfaction of a well-prepared meal, the comforting sound of your family's voices in the cabin. You learned that winter was not just a time to endure. It was a time to reflect, to find peace in the quiet moments, to connect with the land in a deeper way. At times, the isolation was overwhelming. You had heard stories of those who didn't make it through the winter, who had been swallowed by the cold and the loneliness. But as the days stretched on, you realized that you were learning something vital, how to survive not just the cold, but the silence that accompanied it, the mental toughness that came from those long, isolated months became the foundation for everything else. You learned how to be present in the moment, how to conserve your energy when you could, how to rely on your instincts, and how to build a sense of inner strength that no weather could shatter. There were also moments during the quiet nights when the fire had burned low, when you would look outside and wonder if the world would ever change. The deep cold, the endless snow, the isolation, it all seemed so vast, so overpowering. But then you would remember the way the animals survived, how they had adapted over centuries. the foxes and deer, the squirrels and birds, they all faced the same trials, yet they endured. They thrived. They had learned over countless generations how to adapt to the weather, how to find food in the snow, how to make shelter in the cold. You understood then that it wasn't just the physical adaptations that mattered. It was the mindset, the willingness to adapt and change to learn from the world around you. When spring finally came, bringing with it the soft promise of warmth and rebirth, you looked back on the winter with a sense of quiet pride. You had survived. More than that, you had adapted, you had learned, and you had thrived. The cold had tested you, pushed you to your limits, but it had also shaped you. It had made you stronger, more resilient, more in tune with the rhythms of nature. As the days grew longer and the snow melted away, you knew that the lessons learned in the depths of winter would stay with you. They would shape how you move through the world, how you face challenges, how you embrace change. The weather, in all its severity, had taught you that survival was not just about the body. It was about the mind, the spirit, and the ability to adapt. As the first frost of winter settled into the landscape, the world outside seemed to transform into a place of quiet desperation. The ground, once rich with the promise of the harvest, was now locked beneath a thick layer of ice and snow. Trees that had once stretched tall with vibrant leaves were now bare, their limbs heavy with frost, reaching like skeletal fingers toward a cold gray sky. The cold had come relentless and harsh, and with it the promise of scarce food. You had known as the cold set in that the comfort of the abundant harvests would soon be behind you. The supplies you had stored were enough to see you through, but not without careful rationing, not without the constant pressure of knowing that should you run out, there would be no quick fix. The bounty of summer had long since faded, and what remained was a stark reminder that survival in winter was a matter of resourcefulness, not abundance. It was in these moments, when food grew scarce and the snow piled high, that you truly learned the weight of the winter's challenge. You recalled the first hunt of the season, when the crisp air made every breath feel sharp, the cold seeping into your bones even before you set out. Hunting in winter was never an easy task, but this year the challenge seemed greater than ever. The deer and the elk, the usual prey that had once been plentiful, were nowhere to be seen. Their tracks were harder to find in the deep snow, and the freezing temperatures made it harder for even the most skilled trackers to follow their movements. The wind carried no familiar scents masking the trail, and the snow, fresh and unbroken, held no sign of life for miles. You had learned early on that in winter, hunting was less about strength and more about patience. It was about learning to read the signs that others might overlook, finding clues in the landscape that spoke of life still hiding beneath the cold. But this winter, even that felt difficult. The animals were more elusive, holed up in burrows or tucked away in shelters of their own. Even the most seasoned hunters in the village, those who knew the land like the backs of their hands, were struggling. You remember the days when you'd set out with your bow and arrows, the cold biting your face as you trekked through the snow eyes, constantly scanning the horizon for movement. The ground beneath you crunched underfoot with every step, a reminder of the cold that lay beneath the surface. Your breath misted in the air, but it was the quiet, oppressive stillness that made it harder to focus. The world seemed to sleep in the winter months, as though everything was waiting for the thaw. But waiting, you soon realized, wasn't enough. As the days passed and the snow piled higher, you had to become more inventive. You couldn't wait for the animals to simply appear. Instead, you adapted, learning to track not just by sight, but by sound and smell. The slightest rustle of branches, the soft crunch of paws in the snow, were signals you had to pay attention to. But even then, you faced the added challenge of extreme conditions. The air was so cold that even the best made garments couldn't completely protect you. The freezing wind made it harder to focus on the task at hand, and the cold penetrated deep into your muscles, stiffening them with every step. There were no shortcuts, no easy days in the wilds of winter. Every hunt was a battle against the cold, a test of endurance as much as skill. The animals, too, had adapted, retreating to hidden places where the biting winds couldn't reach them. The places where you knew to find them in the warmer months near water sources in the deep forest were now lifeless and empty. The animals long gone to more sheltered places. Every day, you returned to the village with nothing but frustration and exhaustion, your spirit drained as much as your body. But as the weeks passed, you began to rely on more than just your bow and your skill in tracking. You had to become more resourceful. The deep snow made traditional hunting even harder, so you turned to traps, to snares, and nets, to things that could catch game while you rested, while you waited. Setting these traps became an essential part of your daily routine. It was as much about patience as it was about skill setting. The right bait, making sure the traps were hidden in the right places, and returning daily to check them. Yet even with all your efforts, the scarcity of food remained a constant shadow. You began to ration your own supplies, taking only what you absolutely needed, even though every part of you longed for a hot meal, a satisfying stew to fill the emptiness that had grown inside. The cold gnawed at your stomach, and every meal, whether small or hearty, became more valuable than ever. You learned to appreciate the simplest things: a handful of dried berries, a few potatoes, a small piece of meat from the trap. It wasn't about abundance anymore. It was about making do, about stretching what little you had as far as possible. And then came the preservation of what you did catch the next critical step in surviving the long months ahead. You had learned the importance of food preservation as a child, watching your elders smoke meat and dry fish, seeing the way they sealed away provisions in barrels and jars, understanding that nothing could be taken for granted during the winter. Now, as an adult, you found yourself revisiting those lessons, applying them in ways that felt more urgent than ever. The smokehouse became your sanctuary in those long, freezing days. The smell of curing meat filled the air as you hung strips of venison, carefully salted and dried, knowing that every piece was a potential lifeline for the coming weeks. You worked swiftly, methodically, packing away as much as you could. The fish, too, were salted and dried, their delicate flesh hanging alongside the deer and elk. You took no chances. Everything had to last. The icebox, too, became a crucial tool. You had learned how to preserve food not just by drying, but by storing it under the frozen earth where the temperatures stayed consistently cold. The buried meat and vegetables packed away in tightly sealed containers would be there when you needed them most, ready to be brought out when the fire grew low and the cold seemed unbearable. You learned the importance of taking care of, watching every morsel, of never wasting a scrap. Because in the world of winter, every piece of food was precious, every meal earned. But it wasn't just the food you had to worry about. As the cold continued to grip the land, you felt the pull of exhaustion deeper each day. The physical strain of hunting and gathering, of preparing food, of surviving through the endless cold, was taking its toll on both your body and your spirit. You were constantly tired, constantly aching, always aware of the cold creeping in at the edges of your awareness. Yet despite it all, there was a quiet sense of resilience that grew in you, a strength that came not from abundance, but from your ability to adapt. You had learned over the weeks of searching, hunting, and gathering that survival was about more than just the immediate task at hand. It was about understanding the land about using your knowledge of the seasons, the animals, and the weather to predict what would come next. It was about being able to anticipate the challenges of the day before they came, about preparing yourself mentally and physically for what you knew lay ahead. As the weeks passed and the snow began to soften under the touch of the first rays of spring, you found yourself grateful. Grateful not just for the food that had carried you through the winter, but for the lessons you had learned along the way. The winter had been harsh, unforgiving, and it had tested you in ways you could never have imagined. But it had also shaped you, had made you stronger, more resourceful, and more attuned to the rhythms of the land. You had learned to survive not just with strength, but with patience, foresight, and an unwavering determination. And as the first signs of thaw appeared, you realized that you had made it through stronger, wiser, and ready for the challenges that would come with the seasons ahead. As the first bite of winter came creeping in, you couldn't help but feel that familiar weight settling over the land. The chill in the air had turned the sky a dull gray, and soon the sun began to sink lower, setting earlier with each passing day. The world seemed to shrink its boundaries, drawn in with each night that stretched longer, wrapping you in a blanket of darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The nights in winter were never short, but this year they felt endless. Each day you woke up, the sun had barely risen, and by evening it had already slipped behind the hills, leaving the world to fall into darkness for what seemed like hours on end. It wasn't just the cold you had to face. It was the weight of the darkness itself. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, you began to feel something that had never truly crossed your mind before: the quiet toll that the lack of light took on the soul. The cold you had learned to fight. The snow you had learned to move through. But the darkness, it was a different beast altogether. The sun's absence seemed to drain the world of its energy, and with each passing day, the darkness seemed to stretch a little further, a little deeper, until you felt as if it might consume everything. The nights were long, longer than they had ever felt before. You'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside, hearing the creaking of the walls as the house settled into the cold. The fire in the hearth would crackle, but its warmth was fleeting, only temporary, as if even the flames were fighting against the overwhelming cold that had taken over the earth. And in that silence, in the stillness of the night, your mind would wander. You found yourself thinking about the day's work, about the dwindling food supplies, about how much longer the winter would last. But most of all, you found yourself thinking about the people, The silence was deafening, and the isolation, though familiar, felt heavier than ever. You were not alone in this. The entire community felt the drain of the long winter nights. You had seen the changes in the people around you. Faces that once held the spark of energy and optimism were now drawn eyes tired from the endless dark. People who had once greeted you with a smile now exchanged only nods, their voices low, almost weary. The absence of daylight wasn't just a physical absence, it was something that wore down the spirit, leaving an ache that didn't go away. It was easy to forget what it felt like to have the sun warm your face, to step outside and be bathed in the light of day. Now you were all bound together in the struggle to hold on to your mental clarity, to keep your hearts warm in a season that threatened to numb them. But you learned quickly that survival in winter wasn't just about keeping warm. It wasn't about merely making it through the cold nights or the long dark days. It was about finding a way to stay mentally engaged, to keep your mind alive and alert, even as the world around you seemed to slip into a sleep that you could not afford. It was in these long nights, when sleep came in fits and starts, that you began to truly understand the strength of community. It wasn't just the physical warmth of a fire that kept you going. It was the presence of others, the shared sense of purpose, the knowing that you weren't truly alone, even when the darkness pressed in from all sides. Your community, like so many others, had learned the importance of staying connected, of finding ways to keep the mind engaged during those long, cold nights. People gathered together, drawn into the warmth of one another's homes. The nights became a time of storytelling, of shared laughter, of working together to keep the cold at bay. There was something comforting about hearing the familiar voices of friends and neighbors, about gathering around a fire, not just for warmth, but for the simple act of being together. In the face of such isolation, the bond between people became more vital than ever. It was these shared moments, small and simple as they were, that gave you something to hold on to during the darkest times. As the days passed and the nights grew even longer, you began to understand that your own mental resilience was just as important as any physical preparation. You had to find ways to fight the numbness, to keep the isolation from swallowing you whole. Each night after the work was done, you would sit with your family or your neighbors, and you would talk. Sometimes about the trivial things, sometimes about the weight of the world outside. The conversations didn't always make sense, but they didn't have to. It was the act of connecting that mattered, the simple comfort of being in the same room, of knowing that the silence outside could not break the bond of your shared humanity. And it wasn't just the talking that kept the darkness at bay. People found ways to stay busy, to keep their hands and minds occupied. Women would sew, mend clothing, and knit blankets. Men would work on repairs, sharpen tools, and plan for the spring. Children would draw in the dim light their simple creations, brightening the shadows, their laughter echoing through the house. Even though the world outside was frozen and silent inside, the home life went on. The fire burned brightly, and in the glow of its light you found solace. But there were moments when the weight of the night was harder to bear. The silence would stretch on so long that it seemed like the world outside had ceased to exist. You could feel your body grow weary from the lack of light, and your mind began to lose its sharpness. It was during these times when the darkness felt oppressive that you relied on the stories, the old tales passed down through the generations, the legends of the people who had lived through worse winters, who had faced greater isolation, and who had emerged from the cold stronger than ever. These stories became the threads that kept you connected to the past, to the resilience of those who had endured the winter long before you. They were the spark that kept the fire of hope alive. As the nights dragged on, you also noticed the small ways in which the community had adapted to the isolation. There was an unspoken understanding that during these long nights, no one would be alone if they could help it. People checked in on one another, bringing food, sharing news, offering what little comfort they could. When the darkness grew too heavy, when the cold threatened to take hold of the spirit, the community rallied. Neighbors would visit, bringing with them stories from other homes, laughter from their families, and warmth that could not be found in the hearth alone. It wasn't about the material things, not about the food or the firewood. It was about the presence, the connection that could not be severed even by the longest of nights. It was also in these moments when the world outside was silent and still that you began to reflect on the true value of community. It wasn't just about the physical survival, about the fire that kept the cold away, or the food that filled your belly. It was about the mental strength that came from knowing you had others to share the burden with. You saw it in the faces of your neighbors, in the way they looked out for each other, in the way they understood that the cold was something that could break the spirit just as easily as it could freeze the body. The mental toll of winter wasn't something that could be ignored, but it was something that could be lessened when you faced it together. As the weeks passed, and the days began to stretch ever so slightly longer, you came to realize something important. The long winter nights weren't just a challenge of survival, they were a test of character. They tested not just your ability to endure the physical cold, but your capacity for connection, for staying mentally engaged, for finding light in the darkest of times. The nights had stretched on, but they had not broken you. And as the first sign of spring's promise appeared on the horizon, you knew that you had not only survived the darkness, you had learned how to thrive in it. The long winter nights had taught you that even in isolation, even in the depths of the cold, the fire within could keep you warm. And when the sun finally returned, bringing with it the warmth of spring, you would carry the lessons of these long nights with you forever. The winter months had a way of stripping everything down to the essentials. As the cold dug deeper into the bones of the land, and the nights stretched endlessly, the landscape that had once seemed full of possibility now felt barren, empty, as though it were holding its breath. The days were shorter, the food harder to find, and the comforts of the warmer seasons were distant memories. The fire in your hearth, the thick wool blankets, and the steady warmth from the stove were no longer luxuries. They were lifelines. But even more crucial than the warmth and food you had at hand was the realization that survival in these long months depended not just on what you could gather or store, but on the relationships you built, on the way you traded with others to make it through. In the early days of winter, when the first snow had fallen, it became clear the resources that had once seemed abundant in the summer were now limited. The deer weren't as plentiful, and the birds that had once filled the trees had either flown south or holed up in their nests, waiting out the cold. The vegetables in your stores, though carefully preserved, were slowly running low. The simple acts of survival, hunting, gathering firewood, preparing meals, were now paired with a growing sense of scarcity. And so it was, in these times of need when the cold seemed to press in from every direction, that you began to truly understand the power of bartering. Bartering was not just a way to get by, it was the very foundation of survival. In the harshest of winters, when everyone was struggling with limited supplies, you had to rely on more than just your own stockpile. The resources you had were finite, and there was always something you lacked, something that someone else might have in abundance. That's when the barter system became more than just a useful tool. It became a lifeline, a way of ensuring that no one would go without. You remembered your first true barter. The early days of winter had left you with plenty of dried meat, but the potatoes in your cellar were running low, and you knew they wouldn't last much longer. The frost had taken hold of the ground, making it impossible to grow anything new. It was then that you heard about Old Man Hawk, a neighbor who had stored up a vast supply of potatoes but was running out of dried fish and meat, exactly what you had in abundance. The next morning, as the sky was still gray with the early light, you set out with a basket filled with your dried venison, hoping that Old Man Hawk would be willing to trade. When you arrived at his cabin, the scent of burning wood wafted from the chimney, and the small building seemed like a sanctuary from the cold. Old Man Hawk greeted you at the door, his face weathered and kind, a rough-hewn man of few words. You had known him your whole life, but even with the familiarity, this exchange held an air of formality. Bartering was always a delicate thing, a dance of give and take, a subtle negotiation where pride and practicality intertwined. "What brings you this early, young one?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly from years of working the land. "I've brought some dried meat," you said, holding out the basket, "in exchange for a few of those potatoes you've been growing." Hawk studied you for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the basket. He didn't rush, didn't make a decision on a whim. The value of your goods, your worth in this trade, depended not just on what you had, but on how you presented it. He nodded slowly and motioned for you to come inside. "I can spare a few bags," he said finally, after a long pause, his hand resting on the wooden table. "But I'm afraid that's all I can offer for the meat." It was a fair trade, and you knew it. In this world where survival depended on shared resources, everyone knew that fair meant mutual benefit. No one could afford to be greedy or selfish, not when the harshness of winter was at the door. The exchange wasn't just about the trade itself. It was about the unspoken bond that connected you both. Old Man Hawk was not just trading goods. He was offering security, a promise of warmth for the coming weeks. You in turn offered him the same. The potatoes would see you through the days when the last of your own stocks were gone. It was this kind of exchange that kept communities alive, kept them thriving in the depths of winter's grasp. As you left Hawk's cabin, the potatoes tucked securely in your bag, you felt a deep sense of gratitude. The bartering had not only replenished your supplies, it had renewed your connection to the land, to the people who shared it with you. These trades, these small acts of generosity and exchange, were more than just practical. They were the glue that held the community together during the most trying of times. Over the course of the winter, you witnessed more of these exchanges, each one a thread in the intricate fabric of survival. There were those who had plenty of firewood but lacked meat. There were families with an abundance of dairy but no grain to bake bread. Every transaction, every barter was a dance of necessity. What you didn't have, someone else did, and what they lacked, you could provide. It was the natural balance that allowed people to live through the hardest months, not by hoarding, but by sharing, by ensuring that everyone had enough to survive. One of the more memorable trades you witnessed took place in the midst of a particularly harsh week. The storm had come in fierce and fast, trapping everyone in their homes for days. By the time it cleared, the streets were thick with snow, and the houses were buried in drifts. It was then that you heard about the exchange between Ruth and Thomas, two families that had long relied on each other's skills. Ruth had a well-stocked pantry jars of pickled vegetables, dried fruits, and salted fish, but had been running out of supplies like fresh eggs and dairy. Thomas, whose farm was on the other side of the village, had an abundance of chickens, but little food stored away. They met in the middle of the village square, each carrying what they could manage in the cold. Ruth brought bags of beans, preserved apples, and fresh onions. Thomas, a bundle of eggs and a few quarts of milk. As they exchanged their goods, there was no negotiation, no bargaining. They simply traded what they had, both fully aware of the value of the other's goods. The exchange was smooth mutual respect, radiating from both sides, and as they parted, there was a sense of solidarity that filled the air. They had both given what they had in order to ensure the other's survival. Such moments were what kept people going. The winter months tested the resolve of even the strongest people, but it was the strength of the community, the willingness to share and trade for survival that allowed everyone to make it through. In those quiet exchanges, as goods changed hands, there was an acknowledgement of how interconnected life truly was. No one could survive the harshest months alone, not without help, not without trade. Bartering was not just about necessity, it was a symbol of the deep trust that bound people together. You knew that each time you traded, each time you shared something, you weren't just exchanging goods. You were investing in the well-being of your community. The harsh winter months had a way of showing just how much you depended on one another. And in that mutual dependence, you found strength. By the time the spring thaw came, when the snow melted and the world began to wake from its long sleep, the trades that had been made throughout the winter had carried you all through. The food that had been carefully bartered. The firewood shared, the knowledge passed on. These were the things that had kept you alive, kept you whole. And as the days grew longer and the first green shoots began to push through the soil, you realized that the true gift of winter was not in surviving it alone, but in the way that bartering, sharing, and trading had allowed you to face the cold together. These small acts of exchange had been the glue that held the community together, the thread that wove through the harsh months, ensuring that when the winter ended, you would all be there to witness the new beginnings together. The season of winter had a way of settling in deep, both in the land and in the heart. As the cold wrapped itself around the world, holding it in a frozen grip, the land seemed to retreat into itself. The once vibrant colors of autumn were gone, replaced by shades of white and gray that stretched endlessly beneath a sky that never seemed to truly brighten. Days shrank, the night stretching on like an unbroken sea of darkness. With each passing day, the world grew quieter, colder, and more isolated. And in this silence, the true weight of winter's emotional toll began to press down. You had felt it too when the first frost came. It wasn't just the physical cold that bothered you. It was the mental and emotional weight of it. The long nights seemed to stretch forever, and the endless dark seemed to push against the walls of your home. There were mornings when the light didn't seem to come at all, only a slow, gray dawn that felt like a warning of how little warmth the day would bring. You could feel it in your bones, the weight of isolation, the mental exhaustion that came with surviving not just the physical demands of winter, but the quiet, relentless battle against the loneliness that seemed to creep in with each passing day. The world outside was a place of stillness where life seemed to have slowed, where even the animals disappeared into the quiet corners of the forest, waiting out the cold. And inside your home, the silence became almost oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the fire, the occasional gust of wind rattling against the walls, or the soft sound of your own breath. The fire in the hearth was a comfort, but it was also a reminder of the cold of the endless night, of the hours that seemed to crawl by. There was something deeply psychological about the winter, something that crept beneath your skin and found its way into your thoughts, into the way you saw the world. You had always known winter to be harsh, but it wasn't until you faced it in full that you realized just how deeply it could affect a person's mind. There were moments when you found yourself staring at the flame, lost in thought, wondering if the cold would ever end. The isolation, too, had a way of sinking deep into your soul, making you question everything. The loneliness at first seemed manageable, but as the days turned into weeks, then into months, the absence of human contact, of familiar voices and warm conversations began to eat away at you. The silence of winter wasn't just about the lack of sound. It was about the absence of connection, the absence of companionship. You remembered the first days of winter when the novelty of the cold still felt new, and the fire seemed to keep the worst of the darkness at bay. But as the weeks wore on, the cold began to seep into your thoughts, into your emotions. You felt it on the days when you went out to gather firewood, when you trudged through the snow alone, knowing that beyond the task at hand, there was no one there to share in the burden. The solitude grew heavier, the silence more oppressive. You found yourself looking forward to small moments of interaction, the brief chats with neighbors when you crossed paths, the shared glances during the few and far between visits to the local store. But as the winter dragged on, even those small moments seemed to slip away, lost in the ever-present darkness. You weren't alone in feeling this weight. The entire community was affected, each person in their own way. You would notice it in the faces of those around you, the quiet exhaustion in their eyes, the way their smiles had grown more strained, less frequent. It wasn't just the physical toll that winter took. It was the mental fatigue, the emotional drain of enduring something so relentless, so unyielding. The cold seeped into your thoughts, made everything feel heavier, harder. The lack of daylight felt suffocating, as though it was slowly draining the life out of everything it touched. But in the midst of this mental struggle, something remarkable began to happen. The community, despite the isolation, began to find ways to connect, to fight against the loneliness that threatened to consume them. It was during the long, silent nights that the bonds between you and your neighbors began to take on new meaning. You had always known that the strength of the community was vital. But now, in the depths of winter, you saw it in a new light. It was no longer just about shared work or mutual respect. It was about survival, about keeping each other afloat, both physically and mentally. You remember the first time the neighbors invited you into their home for a shared meal. The snow had been falling heavily all day, and the wind howled outside, but inside their cabin, the fire was bright, and the warmth of the room seemed to wash away the cold that had clung to your skin. The food was simple stews, bread and vegetables, but it was the company that made the meal special. The conversation, even if it was just about the weather or the state of the roads, felt like a lifeline. It was in that moment, when you shared laughter and warmth, that you realized just how much the isolation had weighed on you. That evening was the first of many. As the winter months dragged on, more and more people began to seek each other out, gathering for meals, for stories, for shared warmth. The fire in the hearth became the center of these gatherings, and the darkness outside seemed to fade into the background as long as people sat together, talking, laughing, and sharing. It was during these long, cold nights that the true strength of the community revealed itself. the fire was not just a source of warmth. It became the metaphorical light that kept the darkness at bay, not just in the house, but in the hearts of those gathered around it. In a world where the outside seemed to have stopped moving, where the days were so short that you barely had time to feel the sunlight on your skin, the simple act of gathering together became the most important thing. You shared stories of past winters of hardships and survival, of love and loss. And in the telling of these stories, you found something powerful: connection. Connection to the past, to each other, to the shared experience of living through the harshest months. These stories became a way of reminding each other that you weren't alone, that the loneliness of winter was temporary, and that together you could face whatever the cold brought. As the weeks stretched on, you noticed that this sense of community, this bond forged in the firelight, was becoming more than just a way to pass the time. It was becoming a lifeline. You realized that surviving winter was not just about the ability to endure the cold, the snow, or the hunger. It was about maintaining your mental and emotional strength. It was about finding ways to keep the darkness from seeping into your mind, about remembering that even in the hardest of times, there was something to hold on to, something worth fighting for. The bond between you and your neighbors grew stronger as the months passed. The long nights, though difficult, had forged something deeper than just survival. You had become a part of each other's lives in a way that was impossible to explain, a connection that went beyond words. The fire, the shared meals, the late-night conversations, they became the fabric that held everyone together. And it wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about supporting each other mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. The isolation of winter, once a heavy burden, became more manageable because you had each other. When the first signs of spring appeared on the horizon and the days began to stretch longer, you realized that winter had changed you. You had learned to endure not just the cold, but the silence, the isolation, the fear. You had found strength in connection, in the warmth of shared experience, and in the understanding that survival wasn't just about the body, it was about the mind, about staying mentally strong, about finding light even in the darkest times. As the season shifted and the world began to thaw, you knew that the lessons learned in the depths of winter would stay with you forever. Winter was never just a season of cold. It was a trial, a test of endurance, not only for your body, but for your spirit. The biting winds, the endless snow, and the long nights seemed to stretch on without end, pressing against you, suffocating you in its relentless embrace. The cold could chill your bones, make you question how long you could endure. But it was the isolation, the silence that gnawed at you the most. It wasn't enough to face the harsh elements on your own. No survival in winter. True survival depended on something far greater than individual strength. It depended on the strength of the community. It wasn't something you truly understood until the first deep winter arrived, when the snow fell heavily and the winds howled through the trees, stripping them bare. The cabin, which had seemed so sturdy in the warmer months, now felt like a fragile shelter against the storm. Inside, you huddled close to the fire, its warmth a small comfort in the face of the cold outside. But even as you sat there, wrapped in layers, you couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing: the presence of others, the reassurance that you were not alone in this fight against nature's fury. You quickly learned that winter wasn't a solitary battle. When the cold pressed down on your shoulders, when the snow buried the land under a thick, impenetrable blanket, it wasn't just about what you could do for yourself. It was about what you could do for each other. The land was harsh, but the community, the people who shared it with you, could make it bearable. It wasn't enough to have firewood or food or shelter. You had to have each other. You had to rely on the bonds that tied you to those around you, to the neighbors who shared your struggles, your fears, and your hopes. Together you could endure. You think back to the early days of that first severe winter. The storm had come unexpectedly fierce and unrelenting, blanketing everything in thick snow. For days the wind howled and the temperatures dropped so low that even the warmest fire seemed to struggle against it. You were lucky your firewood was stocked, your pantry full, but not everyone was as fortunate. The isolation made it impossible to travel far, and those who hadn't been able to prepare fully now faced the consequences. It was then that the community showed its true strength. You remember the day Ruth, a neighbor who lived a few miles down the road, came knocking at your door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. She had come to ask for help, to share her fear that her family's food stores wouldn't last through the storm. Ruth's husband, Jack, had been bedridden for weeks with an illness, and the extra strain of the storm had left them unable to gather enough firewood. Their small children huddled inside, trying to stay warm, while Ruth did what she could to stretch what little food they had. Without hesitation, you gathered what you could spare. Some of the preserved meats, you had stockpiled extra blankets, and a bag of flour that you had been saving. You could have hesitated, could have found reasons not to share, but the cold had a way of stripping away the selfishness that often clung to people in easier times. Ruth's family wasn't the only one struggling, and you knew that. Neighbors helped neighbors in this world, or they didn't survive. But it wasn't just about the material goods. It was about the reassurance, the emotional support that came with the help. When you reached her cabin, you found Jack still ill, his face pale, his breathing labored from the fever. Ruth had done her best, but the long winter nights had drained her as well. You could see it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the worry. And so you stayed for a while, talking softly, checking in on Jack, ensuring that the fire was stoked properly. There was something powerful in that shared moment, something that transcended the simple act of lending food. It was a reminder that the bonds of community ran deeper than survival. They were about empathy, about sharing the load of hardship. As the winter dragged on, these moments became more common. People found ways to help each other, to lift each other up. In the face of overwhelming challenges, the barter system, though important, was only one part of it. There were shared meals, where everyone brought what they could, vegetables, meats, breads, and ate together. There were firewood runs where a group of men would set out determined to gather enough for everyone's homes to keep the fires going when the cold would otherwise have made it impossible to keep the warmth inside. When a neighbor's roof began to sag under the weight of snow, others would show up with tools and manpower, clearing it off before it could collapse. It was a constant back and forth of help, a web of mutual support that wove through every part of the community. You remember the winter that Clara's young son fell ill. It wasn't just a cold. It was something more, something that turned into a fever, a deep cough, a struggle for breath. Clara was beside herself, pacing the small cabin, trying everything she knew to help him, but nothing worked. The isolation of winter made it impossible to get medical help, and the nearest town was days away, buried under snow. It was in that moment of fear of helplessness that the community showed up in full force. It wasn't just Clara's family that came together. It was the whole village. You remember how you gathered with the others, how the women of the village made herbal teas, heated stones to ease his breathing, and stayed by Clara's side, reassuring her when the fever seemed unrelenting. The men cleared paths to the nearest town, even though it was barely safe to travel. They brought back herbs, remedies, and whatever they could find that might help. It was that night, after days of struggle, that Clara's son finally began to show signs of improvement. There was no magic, no miracle. It was the collective effort, the shared responsibility of looking out for one another that had made the difference. It wasn't just about the physical assistance, it was about the emotional support that kept spirits afloat. There were long nights when the cold seemed unbearable, when the silence outside seemed endless. During these nights, the community gathered sharing stories, playing music, singing songs, and telling tales that kept the dark at bay. Laughter, even in the depths of winter, was a powerful thing. It reminded you that even in the coldest, darkest times, you were not alone. The bonds formed during these tough times weren't just about survival, they were about human connection. In a world where the elements seemed so determined to pull you apart, community was the thread that held you together. There were moments when you thought about those early winters, the ones you had heard about from your elders. They spoke of how difficult it had been, how much harder survival had seemed. But those winters, like the ones you now lived through, had not been about individual strength alone. It was the strength of the community, the understanding that survival depended on looking out for one another. Without that support, without the network of relationships that bound people together, winter would have been impossible to survive. As spring finally began to show its first signs, with the snow starting to recede and the days growing longer, you reflected on the toll that winter had taken. It wasn't just the cold that had been the hardest. It was the isolation, the mental and emotional weight that came from facing the brutal season alone. But now, as the thaw began, you realized something vital. The winter had tested you, yes, but it had also brought you closer to those around you. The bonds you had forged through hardship, through shared meals, through helping one another in times of need, had made you stronger. And as the world slowly came back to life, you knew that the strength of your community would carry you forward through whatever challenges the future might bring. In the end, you understood that winter's true test was not just of survival, but of connection. You had learned that the strongest survival strategy was not about hoarding resources, but about sharing them. It was about trusting one another, working together, and finding ways to make it through side by side. And as the first buds of spring began to bloom, you knew that the lessons of winter would stay with you, that the bonds you had formed would last long after the cold had gone. As the first light of spring began to touch the horizon, there was a quiet stirring in the air. The hard grip of winter, which had held the land in its icy embrace for so long, was finally loosening. The heavy snows that had blanketed everything in white began to recede, revealing the earth beneath still damp and cold, but alive with the potential of new growth. The winds, once sharp and biting, now carried a softer touch, whispering through the trees and stirring the dry leaves that had been frozen in place for months. For you, As for everyone else in the community, the arrival of spring was not just the end of the cold. It was the start of something new, something bright and full of possibility. It was a time of renewal, a chance to shed the weight of the long, brutal winter to begin again with fresh energy, fresh hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. The darkness that had hung over the land, the oppressive cold that seemed to stretch on without end, was finally giving way to light, to warmth, and to life once more. The first signs of spring had arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The snow had begun to melt in patches, retreating back into the earth, leaving behind a trail of wet ground that glistened in the morning sun. You could feel it in the air, the scent of damp earth, the promise of rain, the subtle shift that told you winter was no longer the ruler of the land. The ice that had once clung stubbornly to the trees and streams was now breaking apart, revealing the water flowing beneath free and unburdened. The silence of winter, the stillness that had suffocated everything, began to lift. And with it came a wave of relief, not just from the cold, but from the emotional and mental weight of the long months spent huddled against the elements. You could feel the tension in your shoulders begin to ease, the heaviness in your chest start to lift. The dark days of winter, with their endless nights and constant struggle, had taken their toll on everyone. The isolation, the cold that gnawed at your bones, the scarcity of food, these had all left their marks. But as the first rays of spring touched the earth, you felt something inside you stir as well. A sense of release, a quiet internal sigh of relief that you had made it through. It was a feeling shared by everyone in the community. When the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, you could hear the laughter rising up from the homes and fields as neighbors stepped outside to breathe in the fresh air, to feel the warmth of the sun on their faces. It was a joy so pure, so deep, that it was almost impossible to put into words. The harsh winter had worn you down, made you question your strength, your resilience. But now, with the arrival of spring, there was a sense of something new, a sense of rebirth, of something beginning again. As you walked through the village, you saw it in the faces of your neighbors, the relief, the hope, the quiet joy of knowing that the cold, the hunger, the isolation of winter were finally over. People who had been holed up in their homes for months were now venturing out, gathering in the streets, talking to one another, with smiles on their faces, their spirits lifted. You saw the children who had spent so much time inside running through the melting snow, their laughter filling the air, their energy as boundless as the days that were about to grow longer. The community came alive in spring. And it wasn't just about the return of warmth. It was about the shared experience of survival, the collective effort that had seen everyone through the harshest of times. The trials of winter had bound the community together in ways that nothing else could. It wasn't just about the physical work, the sharing of food or firewood. It was about the emotional and mental endurance that had kept everyone going. You knew now, more than ever, that the true strength of the community lay not just in surviving, but in how people supported each other, how they came together during the darkest times. Now, with spring's arrival, the bonds formed in the depths of winter became even stronger. People gathered in the square, talking about what they had learned, what they had overcome. They shared stories of the hardest days, but also of the small victories, the moments when, despite everything, the fire had kept burning, when the food had lasted just a little longer, when the company of neighbors had made all the difference. There was a new sense of appreciation for the small things, the warmth of a fire, the taste of a fresh meal, the sound of children laughing. As the days grew longer, the work of spring began in earnest. The first signs of new growth were everywhere. The trees, bare and lifeless just days ago, were now budding with fresh leaves, their branches beginning to fill with life again. The ground, once frozen and unyielding, was now softening, ready to be tilled, ready to bring forth new crops. The garden beds, which had been empty for months, were now being cleared, prepared for the seeds that would soon be sown. Everywhere you looked, there was something new, a green shoot pushing through the earth, the return of birds to the sky, the buzz of insects coming to life in the warming air. It was a time of renewal, a time of growth, a time when everything that had been dormant for so long could begin again. But even in the joy of renewal, there was a moment of reflection, a pause to look back at what had been. The trials of the winter, the hunger, the cold, the long nights. These had not been easy, but they had shaped, you had shaped everyone. They had revealed your strength, your resilience, and the depth of your connection to one another. The hardships of winter, though brutal, had made the arrival of spring that much sweeter. Without the struggle, there would have been no appreciation for the warmth, no gratitude for the light. You often thought about how this sense of renewal didn't just apply to the land, but to the people as well. The winter had taken its toll on everyone mentally, emotionally, physically, but now, with the arrival of spring, you could see the transformation. There was a lightness to people's steps, a sense of optimism that hadn't been there before. The community had come through the darkest time together, and now, as the thaw began, there was nothing but hope ahead. You could see it in the way the men worked together in the fields, the women exchanging recipes and gardening tips, the children running free with the first signs of warmth. Everyone had a part to play in the rebirth of the village. The work of the spring planting building repairing was shared by all. And with each new task completed, there was a renewed sense of purpose, a renewed connection to the land and to each other. The air was filled with the promise of what was to come, a harvest, a future, a fresh start. And in the quiet moments when you stood outside and felt the sun finally warming your face, you couldn't help but think of the long winter that had come before. It had been hard, so hard. But now, standing at the edge of spring, you knew that everything had been worth it. The cold had tested you, had tested everyone. But it had also made you stronger, had deepened your connection to the world around you, to the people who had shared in the struggle. And now, with the arrival of spring, you knew that no matter what came next, you could face it with the knowledge that you had survived the worst and were ready to embrace the future. The arrival of spring wasn't just a shift in the seasons, it was a shift in your soul. A time to shed the weight of winter and breathe in the air of new beginnings. The long nights were over, and the days were growing longer, brighter, filled with promise. You had made it through, and now, as the world came alive once again, you knew that the strength, the resilience, and the bonds formed during the darkest days would carry you through the seasons to come. The spring was not just a season, it was a reminder of hope, of renewal, and of the power of resilience. As the first light of spring began to touch the horizon, there was a quiet stirring in the air. The hard grip of winter, which had held the land in its icy embrace for so long, was finally loosening. The heavy snows that had blanketed everything in white began to recede, revealing the earth beneath still damp and cold, but alive with the potential of new growth. The winds, once sharp and biting, now carried a softer touch, whispering through the trees and stirring the dry leaves that had been frozen in place for months. For you, as for everyone else in the community, the arrival of spring was not just the end of the cold. It was the start of something new, something bright and full of possibility. It was a time of renewal, a chance to shed the weight of the long, brutal winter, to begin again with fresh energy, fresh hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. The darkness that had hung over the land, the oppressive cold that seemed to stretch on without end, was finally giving way to light, to warmth, and to life once more. The first signs of spring had arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The snow had begun to melt in patches, retreating back into the earth, leaving behind a trail of wet ground that glistened in the morning sun. You could feel it in the air, the scent of damp earth, the promise of rain, the subtle shift that told you winter was no longer the ruler of the land. The ice that had once clung stubbornly to the trees and streams was now breaking apart, revealing the water flowing beneath free and unburdened. The silence of winter, the stillness that had suffocated everything, began to lift. And with it came a wave of relief, not just from the cold, but from the emotional and mental weight of the long months spent huddled against the elements. You could feel the tension in your shoulders begin to ease, the heaviness in your chest start to lift. The dark days of winter, with their endless nights and constant struggle, had taken their toll on everyone. The isolation, the cold that gnawed at your bones, the scarcity of food, these had all left their marks. But as the first rays of spring touched the earth, you felt something inside you stir as well, a sense of release, a quiet internal sigh of relief that you had made it through. It was a feeling shared by everyone in the community. When the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, you could hear the laughter rising up from the homes and fields as neighbors stepped outside to breathe in the fresh air, to feel the warmth of the sun on their faces. It was a joy so pure, so deep, that it was almost impossible to put into words. The harsh winter had worn you down, made you question your strength, your resilience. But now, with the arrival of spring, there was a sense of something new, a sense of rebirth, of something beginning again. As you walked through the village, you saw it in the faces of your neighbors, the relief, the hope, the quiet joy of knowing that the cold, the hunger, the isolation of winter were finally over. People who had been holed up in their homes for months were now venturing out, gathering in the streets, talking to one another, with smiles on their faces, their spirits lifted. You saw the children who had spent so much time inside running through the melting snow, their laughter filling the air, their energy as boundless as the days that were about to grow longer. The community came alive in spring, and it wasn't just about the return of warmth. It was about the shared experience of survival, the collective effort that had seen everyone through the harshest of times. The trials of winter had bound the community together in ways that nothing else could. It wasn't just about the physical work, the sharing of food or firewood. It was about the emotional and mental endurance that had kept everyone going. You knew now, more than ever, that the true strength of the community lay not just in surviving, but in how people supported each other, how they came together during the darkest times. Now, with spring's arrival, the bonds formed in the depths of winter became even stronger. People gathered in the square, talking about what they had learned, what they had overcome. They shared stories of the hardest days, but also of the small victories, the moments when, despite everything, the fire had kept burning, when the food had lasted just a little longer, when the company of neighbors had made all the difference. There was a new sense of appreciation for the small things, the warmth of a fire, the taste of a fresh meal, the sound of children laughing. As the days grew longer, the work of spring began in earnest. The first signs of new growth were everywhere. The trees, bare and lifeless just days ago, were now budding with fresh leaves, their branches beginning to fill with life again. The ground, once frozen and unyielding, was now softening, ready to be tilled, ready to bring forth new crops. The garden beds, which had been empty for months, were now being cleared, prepared for the seeds that would soon be sown. Everywhere you looked, there was something new, a green shoot pushing through the earth, the return of birds to the sky, the buzz of insects coming to life in the warming air. It was a time of renewal, a time of growth, a time when everything that had been dormant for so long could begin again. But even in the joy of renewal, there was a moment of reflection, a pause to look back at what had been. The trials of the winter, the hunger, the cold, the long nights, these had not been easy. But they had shaped, you had shaped everyone. They had revealed your strength, your resilience, and the depth of your connection to one another. The hardships of winter, though brutal, had made the arrival of spring that much sweeter. Without the struggle, there would have been no appreciation for the warmth, no gratitude for the light. You often thought about how this sense of renewal didn't just apply to the land, but to the people as well. The winter had taken its toll on everyone mentally, emotionally, physically, but now, with the arrival of spring, you could see the transformation. There was a lightness to people's steps, a sense of optimism that hadn't been there before. The community had come through the darkest time together, and now, as the thaw began, there was nothing but hope ahead. You could see it in the way the men worked together in the fields, the women exchanging recipes and gardening tips, the children running free with the first signs of warmth. Everyone had a part to play in the rebirth of the village. The work of the spring planting, building, repairing was shared by all. And with each new task completed, there was a renewed sense of purpose. a renewed connection to the land and to each other. The air was filled with the promise of what was to come, a harvest, a future, a fresh start. And in the quiet moments when you stood outside and felt the sun finally warming your face, you couldn't help but think of the long winter that had come before. It had been hard, so hard. But now, standing at the edge of spring, you knew that everything had been worth it. The cold had tested you, had tested everyone, but it had also made you stronger, had deepened your connection to the world around you, to the people who had shared in the struggle. And now, with the arrival of spring, you knew that no matter what came next, you could face it with the knowledge that you had survived the worst and were ready to embrace the future. The arrival of spring wasn't just a shift in the seasons, it was a shift in your soul, a time to shed the weight of winter and breathe in the air of new beginnings. The long nights were over, and the days were growing longer, brighter, filled with promise. You had made it through. And now, as the world came alive once again, you knew that the strength, the resilience, and the bonds formed during the darkest days would carry you through the seasons to come. The spring was not just a season, it was a reminder of hope, of renewal, and of the power of resilience. As the last traces of winter's grip slowly loosened, and the first warm days of spring began to stretch across the land, the air shifted. The chill, once so relentless, now felt like a distant memory. Yet, in the quiet spaces of your home around the hearth, where firelight flickered gently, the essence of those cold months lingered not in the frost or snow, but in the stories passed down, the words shared, and the memories kept alive through generations. In the deep silence of winter, when the winds howled and the nights seemed to stretch endlessly, you had often found solace in the stories of the elders. Their voices, filled with the wisdom of experience, echoed through the cabin, a reminder that the trials of winter had been faced before and would be faced again. These stories weren't just tales to pass the time, they were lifelines connecting the past to the present, keeping the lessons of survival alive. And now, as the world began to thaw, you understood the significance of those stories in a way that hadn't been clear before. The harsh winters you had endured, the long nights of isolation and struggle, were not just challenges, they were moments that shaped you, that shaped everyone in the village. And when the weather had forced everyone to huddle together, to endure the stories told around the fire became as much a part of survival as the fire itself. These were not stories of heroes or grand battles. They were stories of simple endurance, of people overcoming the odds, of communities coming together when the cold seemed unbreakable. They were stories that wove the fabric of the community itself, binding generations together in a shared understanding of what it took to survive. You remember sitting at the feet of the elders as a child, watching their hands move slowly, telling tales of winters past, of deep snow that had covered the land for months of days when the sun was little more than a fleeting memory. Their voices, weathered and steady, painted pictures of times when the struggle for survival seemed almost impossible, when every meal had to be earned and every fire fought for. The older generations, those who had lived through winters far harsher than you could imagine, spoke with the kind of quiet reverence that only comes from having lived through something that tested you to your very core. They spoke not with pride, but with understanding. An understanding that survival was never just about physical strength. It was about endurance, resourcefulness, and the ability to keep going, even when everything seemed to be against you. You could see the strength in their eyes, hear it in their words, feel it in the way they spoke about the challenges they had faced. These were the stories that had been handed down for generations, the stories that formed the backbone of the community's identity. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, these stories became the touchstones, the guiding lights that helped you and the others through each winter. They were a reminder that you weren't alone in your struggle, that others had walked this path before you and had come through the other side. As you grew older, you began to see the importance of these stories in a new way. They weren't just about the past, they were about the future. The younger generation, those who had never known the depths of winter, needed to hear them. They needed to understand the sacrifices that had been made, the hardships that had been endured. They needed to learn that survival wasn't just about taking what you needed. It was about giving, about sharing, about coming together in the face of adversity. And so, you began to tell the stories, passing them on, just as you had heard them, weaving your own experiences into the fabric of those that had come before. One evening, as the fire burned low and the night pressed in around you, you found yourself sitting with the younger ones, telling them of the winters that had shaped you. They sat around you wide-eyed, listening intently as you spoke of the long dark nights when food was scarce, when the cold seemed to stretch on forever, and when the fire had been the only thing standing between you and the biting frost outside. You told them of the sacrifices, the moments of fear, and the quiet triumphs of simply making it through. As you spoke, you could see the wonder in their eyes, the recognition that these were the stories that had made them who they were, that had shaped the community they were a part of. The younger ones asked questions, their curiosity unending their minds, eager to understand the world they had only heard of in stories. They asked how you kept warm, how you hunted in the snow, how you found food when the land seemed to hold nothing. And with each question, you shared a little more of the past, of the resilience that had been passed down through generations. You spoke of the bond between neighbors, how during the coldest winters, everyone came together, offering what they could firewood food company. These stories weren't just about survival, they were about community, about the deep ties that held everyone together when the outside world seemed cold and unforgiving. It was in these moments, when the firelight flickered on the faces of the young ones, that you realized the power of storytelling. The stories weren't just about the hardships of the past. They were about the resilience of the people, the strength they had found in each other, and the lessons they had learned along the way. These stories were what kept the community alive, what ensured that no one ever truly faced the harshness of winter alone. They were more than just memories. They were the threads that wove the fabric of the present and the future, teaching the young ones the value of community, of resourcefulness, and of endurance. As the years passed and more winters came and went, you continued to pass down the stories, to share them with each new generation. You saw the younger ones grow, heard their own voices telling the stories of the winters they had lived through, and realized that the cycle of resilience would continue, that the legacy of survival would never be forgotten. These stories were not just about hardship, they were about strength, about the quiet power that comes from enduring the cold and coming out the other side stronger. They were the foundation of everything. The food shared, the fire built, the connections made in the darkest of times. They were a reminder that no matter how cold the winter, no matter how long the nights, the community would always find a way through together. As you look out over the land now, as the days grow longer and the earth begins to thaw, you understand that the legacy of those winters lives on in each person, in each family, in every story told. These stories are more than just recollections of the past. They are the roots that keep the community grounded, the lessons that will be passed on just as they were passed to you. And in that passing, in the telling of the tales, the community becomes something greater than just a group of people trying to survive. It becomes a living, breathing testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the strength found in shared struggle, and to the bonds that form when people come together in the face of the coldest, darkest seasons. As the last traces of winter began to recede, the land slowly transformed, shedding its icy mantle in favor of the softer hues of spring. The days stretched longer, the warmth of the sun slowly creeping back into the world, and the once frozen earth began to awaken. It was then, in the quiet shift between seasons, that you found a moment of reflection, a pause to look back on the journey, the struggle that had brought you through the harsh winter, and what you had become in the process. The winter had tested you, yes. It had tested every fiber of your being, from your physical strength to your mental resolve. The cold had been relentless, the darkness long, the challenges many. But through it all, there was something deeper, something that grew within you and within the community as a whole. The battle against the elements, while harsh and unforgiving, had never truly been about survival alone. It had been about something more, about the strength that lived within, about the unity that bound people together, and about the resilience that bloomed even in the darkest and coldest of times. When you first faced the harshness of winter, it seemed like an insurmountable challenge. The cold, the isolation, the fear of not having enough, it all felt so overwhelming. But as the weeks turned into months, something extraordinary happened. People began to change. You began to change. The struggle through winter, the shared experience of hardship, became a collective story of endurance, of standing together when the world seemed determined to tear everything apart. The fire, the shared meals, the small acts of kindness, they weren't just survival strategies. They were the lifeblood of the community. They were what made you stronger, what turned struggle into triumph. And as the first signs of spring stretched across the land, you realized that the true gift of winter wasn't just in surviving the cold, but in what it taught you. It taught you the power of unity, the strength of shared purpose, and the quiet resilience that comes when you lean on each other. It taught you that survival isn't just about battling the elements. It's about battling the isolation, the fear, the loneliness. And in the face of that, you had found something beautiful, the unwavering bond of community, of people who stood by each other no matter the storm. The winter, with all its fury and hardship, had shaped not just you, but the generations before you and those that would follow. It had woven a thread through time, connecting each person who had ever faced the biting cold, the endless nights, and the struggle for survival. The stories of those who had come before you, of the struggles they had faced, and the resilience they had shown, lived on in the words spoken around the fire, in the lessons passed down to the young. Those stories, those hard-earned lessons of survival, were the legacy of winter. And now, as you sat surrounded by the warmth of the hearth, You realized that the struggle through winter had become more than just a season. It had become a way of life, a testament to the strength and endurance of the people who had lived through it. The lessons learned how to endure, how to adapt, how to rely on one another were now a part of you, a part of the community, and a part of the history that would be passed down to future generations. Though the cold never fully leaves, though the memories of winter's harsh grip linger like the faintest chill in the air, the warmth of the community, the enduring spirit of those who had survived left an indelible mark on history. The land would change, the seasons would shift, and new challenges would arise. But the strength forged through winter's trials would never fade. It would live on in the stories, in the faces of the young, who listened wide-eyed to tales of endurance, of unity, and of the people who had come together to weather the storm. As the spring breeze filled the air and the last of the snow melted away, you knew that the legacy of those long winters would continue not just in the history books, but in the very spirit of the people who had lived through them. The lessons of survival, of resilience, of hope in the face of despair would guide the generations to come, ensuring that no matter how harsh the winter, the warmth of community and the strength of the human spirit would always carry them through.